Hey, what's going on YouTube? My name's Lucas. Welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be having a conversation about all the different roles in making a music record from start to finish. And I thought this video would be really helpful because I get this question a lot from collaborators, students, musicians, and pretty much anyone that is involved in music that is interested in creating a song from start to finish. So in this video, we're going to talk specifically about all the different roles and tasks required to complete a professional song. So we're not going to be talking about music business or anything like that. We're purely going to be talking about music creation. If you find this information helpful, check out my channel. I have a bunch of videos on music production, plugins, guitar lessons, things like that. And also head on over to my website where I have free and paid downloads so you can directly support the channel. If you want to follow along with a detailed PDF about this video that has a bunch of different details on all the topics that I'm talking about, as well as specific artists and personnel to check out, you can go ahead and download that from my website, and that will directly support the channel. So that's at www.lucasmasori.com. So I'll leave the link in the description for that. So the first role/task that I'm going to talk about is songwriting. So songwriters are super important in the creation of music. They're essentially responsible for writing the lyrics and chords, coming up with the key, and sometimes the structure of the songs to create a compelling song. When we talk about songwriters, they come in a variety of different flavors. Some of them play instruments as well, so they come up with chord progressions and things like that. Others just focus solely on voice and lyrics. So there's a wide variety of songwriters, and songwriters generally will cross over. Some of them also pursue music as an artist. Some of them are also instrumental musicians as well. So that's songwriters. Some notable songwriters that are worth checking out, that are super famous and have written lots of hit records, are Rick Knowles and Max Martin. Next, I'm going to move on to producers. So this is a really interesting category for me because it's what I primarily focus on, but I also notice that it's a very nebulous category now because of the fact that we have so much technology available. Production is very accessible to people, so the lines have blurred between production and other music creation tasks. So what is a producer? I'm going to break down producers into two basic categories. And none of these are meant to be like derogatory in any way. I just kind of came up with these terms to help me explain this a little more easily. So the first category is going to be an old school producer, and the second category is going to be a modern producer. So we'll start with the old school producers. So we're talking about producers from the 90s and earlier, maybe in the 2000s as well. So there's two types of old school producers. One is the musician style, and number two is the vibe style producer. So the musician style producer is a producer that also plays instruments and things. And back in the 90s and prior to that, what they would do is they would essentially be responsible for organizing the band, choosing the right musicians, rehearsing the band, arranging the songs, essentially working with other artists and musicians to kind of get their songs to fit well on an actual recording. So they would kind of spruce up the arrangements, the parts. They would play things as needed. They would record all the instruments. They would coordinate the band, get them in the studio, get them up, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of like an old school musician style producer. Those producers almost always played multiple instruments and have like a really good understanding of engineering and know how to record different instruments, including drums and strings and so on. A good example of a musician style producer, one of my favorite producers of all time, is Brendan O'Brien. He produced a lot of the hit rock recordings in the 90s, like Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Stone Temple Pilots and stuff. So he's a real musician. He plays guitar. He can record drums and all that. The vibe style producer, like Rick Rubin, and there's a bunch of other ones that are like him as well. They do not play instruments or do any specific music-related tasks. They sort of are responsible for setting the vibe, finding the right people, matching artists with the right musicians and bands and so on and so forth. Like, for example, Rick Rubin introduced Rage Against the Machine to Chris Cornell, which formed Audioslave. So they can be really important. They will sometimes be in the sessions, sometimes they won't be in the sessions, but they can sort of be like a fly on the wall person that will just be like, oh, this sounds really good. You should continue working on this song, or, you should move on to the next thing. So I like to call them sort of more vibe producers. They don't actually play instruments or anything. They just kind of provide more like general feedback, like as though they were a normal listener that doesn't know anything about music. So those are two categories of old school producers. the musician style and vibe style. As far as modern producers, we're going to be talking about 2010s and onward. This is when computers, laptops, and so on have become a staple in the music industry and the music creation process. So we have two types of producers generally. We have the modern musician style producer and then the beat maker producer. So the musician style producers generally play instruments. They're able to write parts on different instruments like bass, guitar, so on, and they can also do vocal production and things like that. So a good example of that type of producer is Omer Fedi, Phineas, Stargate. There's a bunch of them. So they play keyboard, they play different things, and they're able to lay down parts. Another type of producer these days that we have is called a beat maker. These generally work more in the hip hop domain, but they also definitely make pop music and a bunch of other types of music. But so the beat maker, generally speaking, is a specific drum programming type of producer. They may have some basic understanding of keyboard skills and things like that, but they generally don't play instruments proficiently, at least not proficiently enough to play gigs or to go to studio sessions to play instruments. But they make drum beats really well. They can sample stuff. They know how to figure out the style of music really well, and they're generally an asset to making a song. So they're kind of more, I refer to them more as like the beat maker style of producer. So they generally come from the school of making like hip hop using samples and things like that. So they're good at like remixing and all those things. So we have modern musician style producers. I'll have more details in the PDF with like a list of different ones to check out, but like Ian Kirkpatrick's a great one. Omer Fedi. These are like current producers that like play instruments and really can do vocal production and stuff. And then we have more of the beat maker producers, kind of like Sick Drums, like Mike Will made it, these types of other producers that mostly make like kind of hip hop related stuff. So that's it for producers. Now, one of the next phases in the process, and also a lot of these go on simultaneously, so I'm going to talk about that, but one of the next roles that we have are engineers. So we can be talking about a recording engineer, a mixing engineer, or a mastering engineer. So I'm going to break those down real quick. So a recording engineer, their responsibility is to make sure that all the instruments are recorded well to create the record. So they'll record vocals, guitar, bass drum, so on and so forth. Some of them specialize in specific things. Engineers all of them will be competent at editing audio so that there's no noises or anything like that. And some of them will also cross over to production as well. So some of them might play instruments, they'll be able to lay down some things, or they might be able to help write the song, choosing the tempo, choosing the key, just things like that. They generally know how to use the computer and will be able to sequence everything as needed. So we have the recording engineer, which we just talked about. Sometimes they'll have, in big sessions, you'll have an assistant engineer, which will be someone else that will help the recording engineer. We also have the mixing engineer, and the mix, this is also something that's like super frequently talked about in the music community and on YouTube, because it's kind of like one of those black box, like Pandora's box thing. Mixing is this infinite thing where we kind of have like subjective taste at play as well. But the mix engineer, their role specifically is just to make the record sound good on speakers. They are responsible for balancing all the levels of all the tracks, making sure you can hear everything clearly, or at least what's important in the song, and making sure that your song sounds polished and ready to go on Spotify or on the radio or whatever medium you're trying to play your music on. Generally speakers these days, right? In digital platforms. So the mix engineer will adjust the levels, the panning, and will sometimes add effects like reverb, delay, so on, to create a cohesive sounding record. The lines between a mix engineer and a producer are very blurry these days. This is due to technology. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. The last type of engineers, we had three. We had recording, mixing, and mastering. Mastering is also something that's like not very well understood, and I get questions about it all the time. So what does the mastering engineer do? The mastering engineer is responsible for making sure your songs are sounding correct for all the different media that it's going to be playing on. So mastering engineers will, for example, if you have a whole album of music with 12 songs, the mastering engineer is going to make sure that all those songs sound like they're one cohesive project at the correct levels for being streamed or being played on vinyl and so on and so forth. The role of the mastering engineer was a bit more pronounced, a bit more distinct back when we had vinyl and CD and things like that, because the mastering engineers had to worry about adjusting things to the correct levels for those types of media. Now, mastering engineers are still a thing, but their role has changed a little bit because they're trying to make sure that the music sounds correct for streaming platforms, which has like a little bit of wiggle room just because it's all digital. So that's kind of a whole other conversation. But generally speaking, the mastering engineer is just responsible for making sure that your songs are sounding right for release. So they may adjust the loudness of it. They may adjust other different things to make sure that it sounds cohesive with the whole project that you're releasing, right? So that's also a little bit of a blurry category these days. It's poorly understood by most people because it's a little confusing. So we're going to get more into this. So with engineers, we have two basic categories. We have people that are kind of more the old school engineers that work on analog equipment. And then we have the new school modern producers or engineers that work on digital equipment like computers. And there's also everything in between too, which sometimes we call hybrid mixing. Back before it was super common to use computers to record music, engineers had to have a knowledge of analog equipment like mixing consoles, outboard gear, and those types of things to be able to record music, simply put, tape machines as well. So all those things required experience and knowledge to know how to use because they're really expensive equipment, and the only way you would have your foot in the door at a studio using any of that is if you were qualified. So analog mixing, analog engineering, analog mastering was much more of an art. It was not quite as accessible as it is today. Now that we have computers, everyone has essentially a studio in a box on their laptop. So a lot of people have had more access to mixing, recording, and mastering tools than ever before. So we have a whole new wave of younger mixers and producers that are sort of, I don't want to say like bad because there are amazing people, but just the entry level is much lower now because anyone can just kind of do this thing on their computer. So there's a lot of confusion about, what exactly it is that we're doing and how to achieve certain things in the digital domain. But generally speaking, engineers are responsible for recording, making sure the recordings sound good, making sure the levels sound right, and making sure the songs all sound cohesive for the particular project and all sound appropriate for releasing on whatever medium you're putting your songs on. The last thing I wanted to talk about is just how all these people would work together, and in a modern sense, how one person might be doing multiple of these things. Because if you think about it, back in the early 2000s and before, like 90s, 70s, and earlier, these roles would be performed by different people because they're specialized tasks, right? So as I discussed, you would need to have knowledge of analog equipment like tape machines and things to be able to record music in a studio and engineer tracks. But these days you don't need that. So people that use laptops and computers to record music are able to do multiple things. They play instruments, they produce, they can sing, they can record vocals, right? So the lines are super blurry between all these things. But when you're learning how to make music and releasing your own music, it's important to understand the roots and the specific tasks that all come into play to releasing your song, right? So we've talked about songwriting, production, mixing, mastering, all those things. You may have to do all of those things, or at least learn a little bit about all those things to feel like you're putting forth the best effort that you can to release your song or to get your song sounding as good as possible for your release, right? So the lines are blurry between all of those things because we have technology. So that's the super interesting part about doing music right now. A lot of producers have experience doing engineering. Some people that do mixing also do mastering. Like the lines are super blurry, but back in the day, there was a little bit more specialized role. So that's one of the reasons why all of these different things are a little bit confusing for people that are just starting out on making music. One of my recommendations, if you're an artist or producer or anybody involved in making music and interested in creating music from start to finish, you should learn a bit about all these different things and implement them in your songwriting process. So one of the things that I do that I think has really changed the way that I create music is I mix as I go. Because I never want to have demos. I never want to show my clients or people demos. I want to have my music sounding as finished as possible in every session. So I mix as I go. I'm EQing, compressing, doing a lot of stuff that's technically mixing while I'm producing because that's just how I feel working on a laptop makes sense to me. I think it's good to take risks. I think it's good to know about some of the different processes of finishing a record so that you can address some of the things that may come up later down the road early on and just get those out of the way. So that's what I have for you guys today. Let me know if this video was helpful. I'd love to hear from you guys. Go to my website if you want to download a detailed PDF that has more information about all these things that I talked about. I'll catch you guys in the next video. My name's Lucas. Take care.